in terms of so that all of our staff know these are the policies, practices, and procedures that have been modified. This is how we're going to work together to make sure that all departments and units will consistently implement our ADA compliance program. And then also using the action plan to determine if there's any associated costs with the modifications. So say, for example, you have that summer Saturday night movie in the park program. Maybe you've just decided that from this point forward, we're always going to provide a sign language interpreter for that movie in the park program for people that might not necessarily be able to read the captions, or for those movies that you really want to show that have not been captioned, also providing real-time captioning or some type of alternate captioning format that we've identified where costs are involved and that we've included that in our budgeting process. So before I move on, there's a couple other questions that have come up in the chat room. I knew if I said potty training that somebody would tap into that. Thank you. So potty training, the question is the issue on potty training and whether or not that is an ADA violation. So potty training, to require potty training, you need to do that on a program by program, service by service, activity by activity basis. That is something for you to decide, and you will have to provide the rationale to it. So I would look at that a little differently, and my evaluation would be a little differently if it was a 1 hour or 2 hour Saturday morning dance program or arts and crafts program versus it being a 8 hour a day summer camp program. My evaluation would be a little bit different because my resources available are probably going to be different. My staff are going to be different. The ratio of staff is probably going to be different. And whether or not the parent stays, or the parent or guardian stays during the program, or even you modify the policy to let the parent come back during the program to assist with changing a participant. So I'm happy to talk about that question more directly with the individual if there are situations that you have concern with. But at this point, I would recommend that you're doing that type of assessment on a program by program basis. And part of the assessment is, all kids are going to have some kind of accident. So what do you do in the example for all kids? Do we provide? Are the staff able to provide help, or do you call the parent to come back? What happens if the parent isn't able to make it back to the program? In all likelihood, to some degree, you're probably helping the child out in that situation. But definitely, if you have more questions on that, I'd be happy to talk with you one-to-one. And then there's another question here about auxiliary aids. Is this something that we should be providing at larger events, or does a request need to be processed to meet the ADA requirements? That's a really good question. So I've been working with the Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board for a couple of years now, and we've just started going through the summer festival events, and we've started categorizing different types of events, whether or not they're large-scale events or smaller neighborhood or park-specific events. And so their implementation process is going forward, all of their large-scale events will have those auxiliary aids in place, regardless if whether or not they receive a request in advance, but that they're going to be marketing it, say that they have a main stage and an east stage or a west stage, that they'll have the captioning or the sign language interpreters, that they will just automatically provide those. And then in their smaller scale events, they will market those, that if you have a request or you have that need, or who to contact to make that request in advance of the program or event. So, you know, you can look at different ways of categorizing the events. I think that the larger scale events, as a best practice, you should just always make them available, you know, and that's just always part of your budgeting process. If we kind of change gears a little bit, and you're welcome again to ask more questions, if we change gears to the transition plan, remember the difference between the self-evaluation and the transition plan. The self-evaluation was policies, practices, and procedures. The transition plan is about physical and communication barriers to program services or activities. And it requires that we put together a barrier removal plan. Technically, under the ADA Title II regulations, public entities were required to remove their physical or communication barriers to program services and activities by January 26, 1995. Honestly, I don't know any entity that was seriously able to make that deadline. So the point there being is, if you didn't do your transition plan, know we're a little bit behind the 8 ball on that, and that we need to get going on that, especially when it comes to identifying those barriers in our park and recreation facilities. So what does the transition plan include? It's we're identifying the structural changes that need to take place in an existing facilities in order to achieve program access. It should include an identification of the barrier, a solution for barrier removal, prioritization and a targeted timeline for that barrier removal, and then it should assign responsibility. So in some parks, it might be the actual park budget. In others, it might be an operations, maintenance, or public works budget. In others, it actually might be a capital improvement budget. But that's why the transitioning planning process is so important. And then you're required to keep the transition plan on file for public input until it is completed. So for many entities that have multiple parks and facilities like we do, we probably need to update this annually and make it available to the public continuously with those updates. So, you know, we need to figure out what barriers exist in order to figure out what our transition plan should include. So when we're doing this, we're looking at program spaces. When viewed in their entirety, can visitors participate and gain the benefits of the program? Now, the Institute, again, for Center for Human-Centered Design, they have done a really awesome job in updating the ADA checklist that also now include recreation facilities, all those that are part of the 2010 ADA standards. So for like golf courses, swimming pools, playgrounds, there's a checklist in there for those as well. So you can go look at using adachecklist.org for those. Or you could look at using a consultant to go in and do your assessment survey or